My name is Jasmine Reed. I'm 31 years old. I work as a senior product strategist at a mid-sized tech company in Seattle. And 3 weeks ago, at our company's annual client appreciation dinner, I watched a coworker stand up in front of nearly 200 people, including our CEO, and claim with complete confidence that she had built the entire product redesign I had spent 5 months developing entirely on her own. What she didn't know, standing there under the ballroom lights, accepting applause for work that wasn't hers, is that our CEO already had the original project file open on the tablet resting on the table beside him, timestamps and all, and he'd been quietly reading through it for the past 10 minutes. Before I get into it, if you've ever watched someone else take credit for something, you built this story is for you. Subscribe if that resonates, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, because I genuinely read every single one. I need to tell you about the project first, because understanding exactly what it took to build makes the rest of this story land the way it actually happened. 5 months ago, our company won a major contract with a healthcare logistics client, a genuinely significant deal that our leadership had been chasing for nearly a year. The kind of account that shows up in board meetings and gets mentioned in company-wide emails with actual exclamation points attached to it. I was assigned to lead the product redesign that would serve as the centerpiece of our proposal, a complete overhaul of their internal dispatch software, something that required not just design work, but a deep, careful understanding of how their actual field operations functioned. The specific bottlenecks their dispatchers dealt with daily, the workarounds they'd built into their existing broken system just to keep ambulances and delivery vehicles moving on schedule. I spent those 5 months conducting user interviews with their dispatch teams, sometimes driving out to their regional facilities at 6 in the morning to observe actual shift changes, building and rebuilding prototypes late into countless evenings, documenting every decision in a shared project file that our whole department had access to, complete with a full version history, showing exactly who contributed what and exactly when. I want you to understand this wasn't glamorous work most of the time. It was long hours, 3 separate prototype approaches that failed before we found one that actually solved the client's core problem, the kind of grinding, iterative process that rarely gets celebrated, even when it succeeds. My coworker Brianna Voss joined the project team 8 weeks in, brought on specifically to help with the client-facing presentation materials once the core redesign was largely complete. I want to be fair here and say Brianna did genuinely contribute to the final presentation deck, polishing slides, refining some of the client-facing language work that mattered, and that I never once tried to claim as my own. But the actual product architecture, the research, the 5 months of iterative design work that made the redesign functional and genuinely innovative, that was mine, documented clearly, time-stamped, consistently visible to anyone who bothered to open the project file's history. I should mention, because it matters for understanding the pattern here, that this wasn't the first time I'd noticed Brianna's particular talent for positioning herself at the center of finished work. 6 months before this project, a colleague of mine, Derek, had mentioned in passing that Brianna had described a marketing campaign he'd largely built as our collaborative win in a meeting where his own manager happened to be absent. I remember Derek shrugging it off at the time, telling me it wasn't worth the political capital to correct her over one meeting. A few months after that, another coworker, Priya, mentioned something similar in the break room, a client presentation where Brianna had apparently described analysis Priya had built as something the two of them had figured out together, despite Priya having worked on it entirely solo over a holiday weekend. Small things, each one easy to write off individually as an exaggeration or a misunderstanding harder to ignore, once you started noticing them accumulate into a genuine pattern nobody had ever formally addressed. The healthcare logistics deal officially closed 3 weeks ago, and to celebrate landing what was by a significant margin our biggest client win of the year, our company hosted an appreciation dinner at a downtown hotel ballroom. Nearly 200 people, staff, the client's executive team, and our own CEO, Marcus Chen, along with the rest of senior leadership. If you're already curious, stay with me because it gets much more interesting before it resolves. And if this is hitting close to home for you, drop a comment and let me know, because I genuinely read every single one. Midway through dinner, Our department head stood up to formally recognize the project team, and I remember feeling genuinely proud in that moment, smoothing my napkin in my lap, ready to stand and briefly describe the work behind the redesign when my name was called. I'd even jotted a few notes on my phone earlier that day, small talking points about the field research, nothing elaborate, just enough to speak confidently for a minute or two. Instead, before I could even fully rise from my seat, Brianna stood first, moving toward the small stage area, with the easy confidence of someone entirely comfortable being the center of attention, smoothing her dress, smiling warmly at the room, the way someone does when they've clearly anticipated this exact moment. "I'm so honored to share a little about the process behind this redesign." She began, her voice carrying warmly across the ballroom, practiced in a way that made my stomach tighten before she'd even really started. "I spent 5 months really digging into the client's workflow, building out the entire architecture from the ground up, testing prototypes, with their teams iterating constantly until we landed on something that genuinely transformed how their dispatch system functions. It wasn't easy. There were early mornings, late nights, moments where I genuinely wasn't sure we'd crack the problem at all. I sat there, utensils frozen halfway to my plate, listening to my own 5 months of work. My own early mornings, my own late nights described in first person by someone who had joined the project 2/3 of the way through it and spent the bulk of her time polishing slides rather than building anything from the ground up. I want to pause the story here and ask you something because I've thought about it constantly since. If you were sitting in that exact seat watching someone describe your own work as theirs in front of your CEO and 200 people, what would you have done in that first frozen moment? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely didn't know the answer myself until it actually happened. I looked toward our table, toward my department head, toward anyone who might interject, and found only polite, attentive faces. Nobody yet aware anything was wrong, because to a room full of people who hadn't been in the trenches of that project daily, Brianna's confident, detailed description sounded completely plausible. What I didn't know sitting frozen in my seat was that our CEO, Marcus Chen, had spent the earlier part of that afternoon reviewing the healthcare account's full project documentation in preparation for his own remarks later that evening. Standard practice for him before any major client event, wanting to be able to speak knowledgeably and specifically about the work, rather than relying on generic praise. He had pulled up the shared project file on his tablet, scrolled through the version history out of simple diligence, and had a fairly clear documented picture of exactly whose name appeared consistently across 5 months of iterative design entries well before Brianna ever stood up to speak. Marcus was seated at the head table close enough that I could see him midway through Brianna's remarks, glance down at the tablet resting beside his plate, still open to that same project file, and then look back up at her with an expression I couldn't quite read from where I sat. If you're wondering what you would have felt in that exact moment watching your CEO's expression shift while someone else took credit for your work in front of him, I want to ask you directly. Would you have found the courage to stand up and correct the record yourself right there, or would you have frozen the way I did? Tell me in the comments, because I still think about how close I came to simply staying silent. Brianna continued for another minute or so describing specific design decisions, the exact prototype iterations details that were, I realized with a growing sick feeling, pulled almost word for word from project meeting notes she'd had access to but had not personally generated. She finished to warm applause, genuinely warm because the room had no reason to doubt her. Marcus stood next as planned to offer his own closing remarks on the project's success, and I braced myself for a night I assumed would simply end with Brianna's version of events becoming the official one repeated in future case studies, future recruiting materials, the kind of quiet historical rewrite that happens more often than any of us like to admit, the sort of thing that gets baked permanently into a company's internal mythology, within a year or two impossible to correct once enough people have heard it told the same way twice. Instead, Marcus opened with something I hadn't expected at all. He set his water glass down, deliberately, glanced once more at the tablet beside his plate, and looked directly at Brianna still standing near the small stage. "Brianna, thank you for that." Before I close things out, I actually pulled up the project file this afternoon to refresh myself on some of the specifics, and I want to make sure we're giving credit accurately, since this room includes our newest major client. And I think how we handle credit internally says something about how we'll handle their account going forward. The room went quiet in that specific way. A room goes quiet when everyone senses something is about to shift forks, pausing midair, the low hum of side conversations dying out within seconds. I could feel my own heartbeat in my ears. He turned the tablet slightly, not projecting it to the whole room but angling it enough that Brianna standing beside him could clearly see the screen. This is the shared project file's version history. He said, his tone even professional, not accusatory, simply factual. The kind of voice you'd use reading a weather report rather than delivering a public correction. I'm seeing consistent entries across 5 months from Jasmine Reed, documented prototype iterations, user research notes, the core architecture decisions. Your name appears here as well, Brianna joining the file 8 weeks, and focused primarily on the client presentation materials, which, to be clear, were genuinely well done. I want to ask you something here because I've turned it over constantly since. Do you think Marcus already suspected before that dinner that this kind of credit shifting had happened before with Brianna? Or do you think this was simply the first time he happened to have the actual documentation open at the exact right moment to catch it? Tell me what you think in the comments because it's changed my understanding of what happened next. Brianna's face, I watched from my seat, went through several rapid stages. Confusion. First, genuine confusion, as though she hadn't fully considered that anyone might actually verify the timeline in real time. Then a flicker of calculation, her eyes darting briefly toward the door as if measuring the distance. Then something closer to genuine panic. Once she understood the tablet wasn't simply a prop, that Marcus had real time-stamped documentation directly in front of him, visible, undeniable, sitting between them on the table for anyone close enough to glance at it. I think there's just been some miscommunication about how the work got divided, she said, her voice noticeably less confident than it had been moments earlier. I was heavily involved throughout. Marcus, to his credit, didn't turn this into a public dismantling. He simply said evenly, I think it's worth Jasmine sharing a bit about the actual architecture and research process, since that's clearly where the bulk of this innovation happened. Jasmine, would you mind? I stood my legs less steady than I wanted them to be, and walked to the small stage area myself, aware of every step, aware of 200 pairs of eyes shifting from Brianna to me. I kept my remarks focused entirely on the work itself, the specific dispatch bottleneck we'd identified in the client's original system. A choke point that had been costing them nearly 40 minutes of delay per shift. Change the 3 failed prototype approaches before we found one that actually worked, and the field interviews that had shaped the final design, describing one dispatcher in particular, a woman named Carol who'd shown me patiently over 3 separate visits exactly why the existing system failed her team every single afternoon. I deliberately avoided any direct confrontation with Brianna in front of the room, choosing instead to simply let the actual substance of the work speak clearly for itself. I didn't need to attack her credibility. The documentation and Marcus's brief factual correction had already done that work far more effectively than anything I could have said in anger, and I could see scanning the room as I spoke genuine engagement in people's faces, the specific kind that comes from hearing someone who actually lived inside a problem describe it firsthand. Applause followed my remarks, warmer and more specific than the applause Brianna had received, the particular kind that comes when a room has just watched something genuine rather than something rehearsed. I made my way back to my table on legs that still hadn't fully steadied, and my department head reached over and squeezed my hand once briefly without saying anything, a small gesture that told me she understood exactly what had just happened and exactly what it had cost me to walk up there calmly instead of falling apart. Derek, seated 2 tables over, caught my eye across the room afterward and gave a small, knowing nod, the kind 2 people share when they've both quietly watched the same pattern play out before and finally seen it interrupted. Priya texted me before I'd even sat back down a single line that read simply, "Finally." I didn't fully understand in that moment how many other people around that room had been quietly collecting their own small examples over the years, waiting without ever fully realizing they were waiting for someone to finally have the documentation to make it undeniable. The rest of the dinner continued somewhat stiffly at first, the way any room does after an unexpected moment of tension, though conversation gradually returned to something closer to normal by dessert. Brianna left before the event officially ended, slipping out during the closing remarks, and I remember watching her go less triumphant than I expected to, something closer to a tired kind of relief. Here's where things stand now. Marcus asked me to stay briefly after the event ended along with our department head and told me plainly that he'd be having a separate conversation with Brianna the following week regarding what he called a pattern worth addressing, directly a phrase that combined with what I later learned from Derek about the marketing campaign incident and from Priya about her own holiday weekend project suggested Marcus had done some quiet additional checking of his own, after that dinner reaching out discreetly to a few other team leads to ask whether anything similar had ever come up before. I was formally promoted to senior product strategist 2 weeks later, a role that had genuinely been earned through the healthcare project's success, though I won't pretend the timing didn't feel in some small way connected to that dinner as well. My department head told me privately over coffee a few days after the announcement that the promotion had actually been under discussion for weeks already, but that the dinner had, in her words, made it very easy to finalize the decision without any lingering doubt in the room. Brianna remains at the company, though she's since been moved onto a project team with more structured, individually tracked deliverables, a change that felt to those of us who understood the full context less like punishment and more like a genuinely necessary correction to how her work gets documented going forward. I heard secondhand through Priya that Brianna's new manager now requires individual contribution logs for every deliverable a policy that apparently didn't exist for her team before, but does now. I want to be honest that Brianna and I haven't had any real conversation about that night since it happened. She's been noticeably quieter in team meetings, more careful with her language when describing collaborative work, and I've chosen not to push for any dramatic reconciliation or confrontation of my own, since I genuinely believe the documentation spoke for itself far more clearly than any conversation between the two of us could have. Derek and Priya, for their part, have both told me separately that watching that moment unfold gave them a strange kind of closure too. Proof that the pattern they'd each individually noticed and individually let go wasn't just something they'd imagined. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. Do your work well and document it consistently, not because you're anticipating betrayal, but because clarity protects you even when you least expect to need it. The version history that saved my credit that night wasn't created for that purpose. It was simply good practice, the same good practice I'd use on every project, and it turned out to be exactly the kind of proof that speaks louder than any argument could. I think often about how differently that night might have gone if I'd been careless about documenting my own process, if the file had simply shown a jumble of unattributed changes instead of a clear, consistent timeline. The habit itself, boring and unglamorous as it felt in the moment I was building it, turned out to be the entire reason the truth had somewhere solid to stand on when it mattered most. If this reminded you of a moment when your work got credited to someone else, share this with someone who'd understand, someone who might need to hear that documentation, however unglamorous it feels in the moment, is sometimes the quietest, most reliable form of protection you can build for yourself. Tell me in the comments, would you have found the courage to correct the record yourself in that moment, standing up in front of 200 people? Or were you relieved the way I was that someone else's diligence did it for you before you had to? And tell me honestly, do you think Marcus handled it the right way, factual and measured, rather than a public dismantling? Or do you think Brianna deserved a harsher moment in front of the room? And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. I'll see you in the next one.